Hello and welcome to this episode of the Bible Toolbox. I'm Luke,
And I'm Chris.
and we're here to help you enjoy the Bible through the tools that scholars and programmers have created for you. And we're continuing our series going book by book through the New Testament, doing a review of the Bible Project videos. And so now we are on to the Gospel of John.
Woo.
So, okay, the Bible Project, when they outlined the Gospel of John, and they said their thesis, and they just quoted um, John 20:30 as
Hmm.
their thesis, and I thought that was a bit lame. I mean, it's
Yeah,
true.
right.
Um,
It's one of the only
so
books that just has a thesis statement
yeah,
in it, right? This is why I wrote. But yeah.
so I tried to go through the Bible Project's video and like, what's their actual thesis? Like, what's the Bible Project's distinct take
Okay.
on John?
I like it.
So here's what I got. I don't know if it's great or perfect, but so Jesus, the I am in flesh and King of the world, revealed through signs and teaching, conquers sin and evil by letting it conquer him so that he can conquer it with his greatest sign, the resurrection.
I like it.
So the thing I'm missing here is the idea of life,
Hmm.
receiving life. Um, but
Yeah.
if I added that, it's already kind of a clunky thesis statement at this point. But I'm
Yeah,
trying to
and
get in
even
their focus of the I am and the focus of the signs.
hmm.
That seems to be what they honed in on.
Yeah, I agree
Um,
with that. I might take issue with that actually later on, but yeah, that's definitely central to their presentation.
yeah,
Both those points.
yeah. So they split up the book basically into two main parts. You get chapters 1 to 12, which has the signs in it, and then 13 to the end, which is 13 to 17 is his final words, final discourse, and then 18 begins the his final week, the death and resurrection, and then
And
the
that's
epilogue.
that's pretty standard for John's structure.
Yeah,
Most people agree. Two or four divisions, whether you count the intro, the prologue, and the epilogue as distinct parts, but two major chunks breaking into
right.
12 and 13.
Yeah, that's what I found.
Hmm.
Is like 2 to 12 climaxes with Lazarus,
Hmm.
and then 13:21 about the passion.
Yeah. And
Um,
I mean,
yeah,
in there, they make two videos, so you get uh, that major split at 12. But for me, 13 through 20 should be definitely considered a coherent block. Obviously, there's transition. The 13 through 17 is just basically one conversation between the disciples and Jesus, and then the crucifixion. But it, constantly in 13 through 17, he's talking about his death and his departure and things in the resurrection. So that, I think those pieces go together.
okay.
But
So why do you think, Chris, that the synoptics all climax in Peter's confession,
hmm.
where John climaxes in Martha's confession, and Lazarus, and like you have this, he raises someone from the dead,
You're right.
and then that's when the leaders are like, all right, that's far enough. We need to kill him. Why do the synoptics not mention Lazarus, and why these different climaxing on who confesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of questions in that question. I'll answer the why did the synoptics not mention Lazarus first? And this is speculative, but most people agree John's written last and probably then written after Lazarus has died again.
Mm,
And we know from John 12 that the Jewish leaders, opponents of Jesus, are seeking to kill Lazarus. And so there's this idea that in other places in the gospel too, like the fact that John names the high priest's servant who Peter cuts with the sword, and he names him Malchus, but he's not named in any other gospel. And there's the idea John scholars have of protective anonymity, that the synoptics don't name or show these stories because they were too volatile or would have brought persecution. But John's writing so late that he can name names and tell the whole story, which I
mm.
think is historically plausible. Um, why does it climax in Lazarus's resurrection is a really interesting one. In the synoptics, in a way, yeah, the climax of the narratives are Peter's confession, but the climax of opposition to Jesus in the synoptics is usually the temple cleansing.
Mm,
And John has moved that early. John has that at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He's either moved that or he just tells that story early. Maybe it happens twice or maybe it happens 10 times. Who knows? But um, I think for John, the conflict between life and death, which is put on display in the resurrection of Lazarus, Jesus sort of epileptically defeats death, is so central to who Jesus is that it makes sense that this is like the high point of opposition. Will you choose life or will you choose death? Are you on the side of Jesus or the side of people trying to kill the guy Jesus resurrected? So that's the high point of the tension. There may be another. Oh, Martha's confession. That's a really interesting one too. So let me just name an assumption here. We're talking about that scene as though it's the climactic sign, the climactic moment of opposition, and I think that's true. But the way that the Gospel Project or the Bible Project video displays it, this is the sixth of seven signs.
yeah.
And I'll just say that that's an unpopular view in John scholarship. I don't hate it, but for example, we call the first section 2 through 12 the book of signs. And the reason is most scholars count seven signs as it's a complete sign source. That was originally like a source critical decision um, for like how John came together. And they thought John put seven signs together. The problem is John's gospel starts, he names the first sign. This is the first sign he did. He names the
Yeah.
second sign. This is the second. And then he stops counting. And so it's sort of up to you, right? But if there are seven signs in the book of signs, then the resurrection of Lazarus is a really climactic moment in the end of the book of signs. If there are six signs, then yeah, we have to look forward to the resurrection as the seventh sign. The problem then is you're not that in order to get six, I think you have to not count walking on water, which seems like a sign to me.
Okay.
Um, or yeah, not you have to count walking on water, not count walking on water, or you have to not count like the resurrection of the official son or daughter, or Lazarus's resurrection, or feeding the 5,000, all of which to me are pretty clearly signs. So I count seven signs in the book of signs, making the resurrection an eighth sign, which I think is also theologically interesting, sort of like an eighth day.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
Would
anyway,
Wright and Bird put the
yeah,
crucifixion as the seventh sign?
yeah. So this is the kind of beef that I'm getting into. When in the thesis statement you distilled from what they write, the I am statements and the signs, no doubt, are really important for what John is doing. I just think when we start counting and saying it needs to be seven, or there needs to be seven in this source, and there need to be seven absolute I am statements and seven what relative I am statements. I'm not sure how they like. I just you're going to disagree about how you count, what counts, and there's such a temptation to have your count lead to seven
Yeah.
because that feels climactic or whatever. That I'm a little bit skeptical, and I and
Okay.
I I don't think it needs to be. So, like I just don't think John like succeeds or fail as a narrative or as a gospel based on whether or not there are seven, you know. So I wouldn't make that my thesis, but that's yeah, maybe that's just
What would you
above my
make
head
your
space.
thesis?
Oh man. I mean, I don't want to fall back just on John's own purpose statement of writing. Maybe there's like a purpose statement and a kind of thesis, which is kind of what you divided also. Why did John write? He wrote so that you'd believe or go on believing that Jesus is the Christ and have life. So the thesis is something like Jesus is Israel's God incarnate and is life and gives life, something like that.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
Where does
yeah,
where does light fit in that? Light and dark. Like what are these
yeah.
like the competing themes throughout John?
There's
Yeah.
so many.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, light and dark, true and liar, born from above, born from below, um, life and death. So I picked life in my sort of impromptu thesis statement just because it's part of John's purpose statement in John 20, and because I think that sign with Lazarus is climactic. Um, and then obviously the resurrection of Jesus is pretty climactic. But yeah, if you just look at the prologue, like so many of these themes, these dichotomies are laid out. Um, and I would say that then the readers sort of signaled these are the tensions that we're going to be looking for in the text. And if you're just counting I am statements, that's not in the prologue, right?
Mm,
But if you're sensitive to Old Testament echoes or allusions there, you have the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, which I think as a reference to Exodus 34, where God's name, the Lord gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and mercy, faithfulness, is is told to Moses. So there's this already that Jesus is presented as the one in whom Yahweh is fully revealed, and we've seen
mm,
his glory. So that's not an I am statement. Again, that's where like the counting thing, like looking for particular lex cues sometimes can sort of narrow your vision, I think.
sure.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the purpose statement at the end of John. That this
Yeah.
has come up multiple times. Because there's the Greek syntax here is a bit ambiguous.
Hmm.
So you kind of already said it. Does it um so ESV reads now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that,
Hmm.
right? And this is where he wrote this purpose statement, so
Hmm.
that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you have life in his name. So the first difficulty is uh, how to translate may believe. So this
Yeah.
is the difference between an aorist versus present subjunctive. There's a text variant. And if it's present, is that significant, right? Does he want you, is this apologetic? He wants you don't believe, but he wants to convince you that
Hmm.
you should believe. Or is he trying to confirm somebody who's already believing their faith so that they continue to believe?
Right.
Um, and then the second one is the phrase Jesus is the Christ. You could also do the Christ is Jesus. So is
Mm.
the main point of John to identify who is Jesus, or is the main point to identify who is the Messiah?
Interesting. Yeah. So you get into questions of who the audience is. Do they already have a concept of a Jewish Messiah, and John's trying to say this is that guy?
Yeah.
Or have they heard of Jesus? Maybe they're Gentiles, and he's trying to say this Jesus guy is the Jews' Messiah. Yeah, this is different. That's interesting.
And so Wright and Bird argue for the Christ is Jesus, and they point to chapter 4, or the woman at the well,
Hmm.
where she goes to the town and says, "Could this be the Messiah?"
Hmm.
Right. That's kind of like the
So
question.
they're
It's
looking for the Messiah.
they're
Yeah,
looking for
yeah,
the Messiah and they're trying to
yeah.
identify who is the Christ.
Mm.
So I didn't know if you had any
Yeah.
thoughts on this.
I mean, I tend towards a really Jewish kind of background for John's authorship and probably then audience. He just assumes that his audience knows a lot about the Old Testament, I think. Um, yeah, so and even I mean that's how I read John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. Sometimes people want to point to Stoic philosophy backgrounds to say that John is playing with Logos ideas from Greco-Roman philosophy. I just read Genesis 1 as the background of that. And so that's my bent in general reading the Gospels. I think it's really Jewish. I think John's audience is deeply familiar with these Jewish ideas. So maybe I go with the second one, the Christ is Jesus.
Okay,
But
cool.
that's a little bit semantic, right? I mean, like if if you're talking to Jews and you say Jesus is the Christ, you still communicate he's the one you've been waiting for, right?
Right. Right.
I mean, because I do think that the identity of Jesus is obviously a very central theme. He's not just trying to like fill out a concept of the Messiah. He's trying to say this guy was before creation. He made everything. He only does what the Father does. Like there are ways that he's playing with or like filling out the identity of Jesus that actually break Messiah categories too. So,
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
mhm. Where do
Awesome.
you lean on this? The purpose, evangelistic, catechetical, anti-Gnostic?
I really don't know.
Mhm.
I didn't really look into it too much.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it depends on how you, John, well, I'll just say this. One of the things I love about this Bible Project video is it is doing John scholarship or like summarizing John scholarship in a way that's very in touch with how the church actually reads John. And in some ways, that puts it out of touch with John's scholarship, how the academy reads John. I think, and maybe this is
Mm,
just because I've studied John more than other books, but there tends to be a bigger divide there than there is for other books, where the academy's talking about John in ways that the church doesn't care about or attend to or um, just very different. Like they're not listening to the academy. And in some ways, I think it's good that they're not listening to the academy because there's a lot of ideas in John's scholarship about historical backgrounds or like uh, redaction history that are pretty speculative and actually really change the way you read the text, that are out of touch with tradition and yeah, not great. So I like that the Bible Project has leaned into this more church-oriented way of reading John.
yeah. So yeah,
And
why don't we talk more about that? About
well, so the last on the last purpose thing, I think some of the like anti-Gnostic and docetic, especially those ways of understanding the purpose of the gospel have come out of historical reconstructions um,
yeah.
that I just think are like deeply speculative. And if we'd said, yeah, John is docetic to like the church fathers, they would have been really confused.
Could it be so like First John, the epistle, First
Hmm.
John begins with a very kind of anti-docetic statement
Hmm.
where you have like we touched with
Yeah.
our hands the word of life,
Hmm.
right? Um, and I wonder if some of that is being read into back into like the Gospel of John, and its purpose is to affirm that the Word has come in flesh. He
Hmm.
cries, he,
Yeah.
like he has body. He's letting
Yeah.
Thomas touch him.
Right. Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's definitely part of it. And I think even yeah, so people will read First John, the epistle, as a kind of correction within the Johnny community of
oh,
Christians that have like read the gospel or been traditioned in a way that was docetic. And so First John needed to correct
okay.
within the community. So there's but it all depends on how you piece together this again, pretty like theoretical, hard to prove historical background that's based on really limited evidence, actually.
Mhm. So talking about the redaction,
Hmm.
the source criticism stuff. So my understanding is a front runner in this was Rudolf Boltmann,
Hmm.
and he pointed to things they're like seams in the
Yeah.
Gospel of John. So you get this in like the end of chapter 14. The very last verse
Hmm.
says, "Rise, let us go." Well, chapter 14 is all about like be comforted, the Holy Spirit's coming and he's going to teach you all things
Yeah,
and
an upper room
whatnot.
discourse. So they're together in that
Yeah.
in the yeah. He
And
just
then he
left their
says,
feet.
"Rise, let us go from here."
Hmm.
And you'd expect like, all right, now they're going to go to like you'd expect some sort of narrative account. But
Hmm.
then chapter 15, I am the
Keeps
true
going.
vine and my father is the vine dresser and
Yeah.
and so on. So this is like pointed out as like a seam, and then there's other ones as well where it
Hmm.
seems like maybe 14 and 15 weren't originally together, and Boltmann rearranged the Gospel of John in his commentary of what he thought was like the original
Yeah.
order.
Bold move.
So
Yeah, I mean,
what do you do with these seams or what?
yeah, it's a good question. I think that's a good example. That's sort of the parade example. And there's another one in 15, I think, where he says something like, "None of you asks me where I'm going."
Oh,
But in 14, they had just asked him, like, "How will we follow you? We don't know the way." Um, and and so scholars have been like, "Okay, clearly this is two sources stitched together." I It's hard to disprove that, right? So like
mhm,
maybe. But I also would point out that John as a narrator breaks chronology and adds parenthetical statements all the time. Um, like the obvious, I think maybe first example is in John 2, temple cleansing. He says the disciples didn't realize what he was saying at the time, but after his resurrection, they recognized these scriptures were written about him. And there's a bunch of like the famous, they call the John in parentheses. They're all over. And he's just So scholars have talked about the function of time, narrative time in John's gospel as just not what you think it is. He's not, and even like I hinted at earlier that the temple cleansing may be moved early. Most people think Jesus probably only cleansed the temple once, and that happened probably late in life according to synoptics, and so John's doing something. I just would give the author freedom and authority to move the narrative around. He seems intent on doing that, and at times that might sort of abrade our modern chronologies, but the narrative works on its own. It's not dysfunctional, um, even if it has some bumps.
sure,
Most of the time, the bumps actually add like theological insight. Um, so I, just as someone who tries to read it as a narrative, I think the seams are the scholars make a lot of the seams when they're odd, but they're not disruptive to reading.
sure.
Yeah.
I had this thought. Um, I kind of liked the Bible projects for Jewish institutions, for Jewish feasts,
Hmm.
but I couldn't find like a commentary
Yeah.
that laid that out as clearly.
Hmm.
Uh, Raymond Brown came close, where
Three
um,
feasts.
he had three feasts, and the Bible Project is counting the Sabbath as a feast,
Okay.
which is actually kind of how Leviticus does it. So
Yeah.
um, it's not
Interesting.
completely like unheard of or uh,
Does Brown just not mention that? That's John 5, right? Is that just not in his?
he didn't call it a feast.
Okay.
I forget exactly how he outlined it.
Okay.
Um, he had a similar structure as the Bible Project, but just kind of named things a little differently.
Hmm.
But it made me wonder if the temple cleansing was brought up in order to you know have these kind of clear like
Yeah.
we need four Jewish institutions.
Yeah.
Temple, chapter 3, you have the Pharisee, Nicodemus. Chapter 4, um, the well, the water.
Yeah.
Is that what
Yeah.
it
I
is?
think so. Yeah.
And then, um, what am I missing?
Well, 5 would be Sabbath, but we're not there yet.
No, no, no. What's the institution? Wedding, the cleansing, the changing water into wine,
Yeah.
maybe. Um, yeah, like maybe that was a reason for moving it forward was to kind of lay out the institutions and feasts
Yeah.
in a
That's
more
interesting.
yeah
See, that's where I'm like, let's read it how it is, rather than saying it's inherently problematic. I think because often it does bear fruit to say, let's see how the narrative's laid out.
yeah.
So I disagree with Beaumont's project, I guess. No surprise.
All right, so that's one way that the Academy is reading like this redaction and source
Hmm.
rearranging thing, and a second one is this Johannine community.
Hmm.
Um, so here I'll explain it how I understand it, and then
Yeah, great.
you can correct me. So Raymond Brown and Louis Martin kind of um, they both wrote major works on the Gospel of John and separately came to the same conclusion that uh, John is he's he's late, right? He's
Mhm.
90s, hundreds, or whatever it is. He's late, and he's writing his gospel for his community, his in his time, who have been kicked out of their synagogues. And so he's what he's doing is he's rewriting the story of his community being kicked out of the synagogue in kind of like the words of Jesus.
Mhm.
And so then that's being imported back onto um, the 20s and 30s where synagogues didn't exist in Judea. And so it's a it's a later development on this earlier time period.
Mhm.
So the Johannine community who he's writing to, he's talking about their problem in terms of Jesus's life.
Mhm.
And so it's not really about Jesus's life, it's really about the Johannine community.
Yeah, and just to highlight that synagogue point, there's a couple passages in the Upper Room Discourse. There's one, and then in John 9, there's one where it says people who believed in him, the leaders were kicking out of the synagogue.
Yeah.
So the question is like, well, which synagogue, when, and who, and which people? And yeah, they're saying this is about second century Christians being kicked out of the synagogue. Yeah.
And some of that has been evidenced on uh, at some point there were curses against Christians added to the um, the benedictions of the prayers that they would pray in the synagogue.
Hmm.
Um, and so some people thought that that happened at the Council of Jamnia, which is around 70 AD. And so John would be talking about a a time post that
Hmm.
where Christians are now cursed and forced out of the synagogue. So what do you do with that? I'm sure very few people have heard of that idea of
Yeah.
John.
That's a good example of ways that John's scholarship in the academy is just out of touch with the way church people read the text. And I think the way church people should read the text. Um, yeah, I mean, again, I would say I'm trying to read John as a narrative that works on its own terms. And in particular, you pointed to this. There's sort of two ways of reading presented here. One, as proposed by Brown and Martin and Attridge and some others, is to say this story pretends to be a story about Jesus, but it's really a story about the owning community. The other way of reading the text is this is a story about Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm just like much more sympathetic to that way of reading. Rather than saying this is a kind of like allegory for the issues and needs and history of a people that um yeah, I'm just gonna say I'm gonna read this as a kind of a literal reading of the story. And then that's not making historical claims really. I'm just trying to say I'm gonna read the narrative as it purports to be, rather than
Hmm.
saying like I know better than I mean, yeah. So I don't really go that direction. And there's a lot that reading though has been hugely influential in most of the 20th century that kind of dominated. Recently, there have been, I think, really helpful critiques of that view based on the fact that there's not much evidence that it's based on. And even archaeologically, there might be an argument to make that there were synagogues in the first century. So it might be rooted on bad archaeology. And even if it's good archaeology, it's a really small amount of evidence. So I think that idea actually will die over time. And I'm glad that it hasn't soaked into church readings.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a big uh, witness against it or whatever. Richard Bauckham
Yeah.
wrote this book called like the Gospel for All Christians or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, where he just points out that like leaders in the early church were traveling all around and like um, comparing notes basically of
Hmm.
um, so like there probably was a community that John was writing to, or he had in mind, but um,
He was writing for the church.
he was writing for the church, which
Yeah.
was very connected. Just
Mhm.
like think of Acts, where you have Paul traveling all around Asia Minor and into Europe and so on.
Yeah. That
Um,
book Bauckham edited is great. The Gospel for All Christians or all people, maybe.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, but then he also wrote a book called The Testimony of the Beloved Disciple, where it's more of a commentary on John and its history and background, and it's explicitly confronting this Johannine community hypothesis, and he doesn't agree with it. And I think he does a really good job arguing that this is a cohesive narrative,
Hmm.
and not something that's pieced together over a decade or two by multiple authors in a community.
Yeah, and something to add there of if we take John as a cohesive narrative, um, who does John think he's writing for?
Hmm.
Um, and you get like at the end of chapter 4, not the end, but okay. So the people come out, the woman goes to the village, and then they come out and they hear him teach. And then it says, they said to the woman, "It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves. We know that this is indeed the Savior of the world." So he doesn't think his message is merely just like for this specific group of people, but it's intended for the whole world. He's
Hmm.
making a claim on every person
Right.
in his text.
Yeah.
Whoever believes in him shall have life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not, yeah. His purpose is not sectarian,
Yeah.
which is the way that this community is often depicted. I totally agree with that.
All right. So if it isn't written for a community who's being kicked out of synagogues, then why was John written? And asking this, what's its relationship to the other gospels?
Yeah.
How'd you narrate that?
Um, so I lean towards that evangelistic kind of purpose, in the sense that, well, I don't think John like contravenes the historical narratives of the synoptics. But I think he's more forthright about presenting not just the historical events, but what they mean theologically. That's kind of evidenced in his use of the word signs, even rather than what the other synoptics have miracles. John doesn't use the word miracles; he uses signs. And the point is that these things Jesus did, he didn't just do them; they mean something about who he is and the claim he has on the world and on you. And I think that is pretty central to the heart of John's writing. He wants to show not just the historical data, but the theological significance of the life of Jesus. Um, and so he is more explicit theologically than the synoptics, I think. Um,
Mhm.
and maybe that's just kind of like old man energy. He's just like an elder in the church and he's got nothing to hold back and he's saying his stuff. But maybe there was a need in the church for a kind of theological interpretation of the historical life of Jesus, and John wanted to provide that. Um, that's plausible to me. I think there's probably a bunch of reasons why
Mhm.
he wrote. There are clearly stories he wanted to share that hadn't been told in the synoptics, like Lazarus, and maybe again that protective anonymity idea, um, that as these saints, these early Christians were dying, he thought now we can tell the whole story. Um, and John does also, again, purport to be written by an eyewitness who knew Jesus personally, who was loved by Jesus. And I think he wanted to share like the real intimate data. The upper room discourse is a great example of that, where this is a huge extended discourse of Jesus, that was only for insiders, right? It's only for like his closest group of followers, and we get 4 chapters of this like pretty direct instruction about the Holy Spirit, about Jesus' identity, Jesus' mission, about the mission of the apostles. All that stuff feels like insider upper room kind of discourse. And like just compare that to Matthew's discourses, which we've talked about. were a lot about Jesus's public teaching. Um, Obviously critical for catechesis, for the early church, for discipleship. And yet John does have this distinctive message that he can deliver because he was there reclining against the chest of Jesus as he said these words. I think that's pretty special.
Hmm. Yeah. So you'd be on the more supplement
Yeah,
the
I think
Gospels
so.
kind of round. Yeah, and I think Richard Bauckham has another, I think an article or chapter somewhere about John for the readers of Mark.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and so whether it's Mark or not, it uh,
yeah.
like there's clues that as you read John that he assumes that you know the synoptics.
Hmm.
So he'll be like talking about John the Baptist, and he'll be like, "Oh, this is before he was beheaded,"
Right,
but then it never talks about John being beheaded,
right.
or um, I think when
Even
it,
even his disciples didn't understand this until after the resurrection. Like,
yeah,
wait, what? He's like he just started his ministry. So he's assuming like he gets killed and he comes back to life. His readers know this stuff. Yeah, that's I think that's
yeah.
a fair.
So yeah, it seems like an intentional supplement. Like you guys
Hmm.
already know some of these stories. I'm going to add to them,
Hmm.
and I tend to think that that's why some major events are left out.
Yeah.
So like I have here, where's the Transfiguration? Where's the Last Supper?
Hmm.
And it's like, well, um, instead of the Last Supper, you get all of 14 to 17. You get the like the whole discourse that he's having.
Right.
And instead of having like, this is my body, take and eat, like rather than having the words of institution, he gives you John 6. I'm
Hmm.
the bread of life, who's come down from heaven. Eat
Hmm.
my flesh and you'll have life. So it's kind of like the theology of the Last Supper has been moved forward to the feeding of the 5,000.
Yeah, that's well said. It's interesting. I think the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle that's in all four gospels.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, so um yeah, that's just a good illustration, I think, of the John is doing he's telling new stories. There's not a lot of overlap in terms of the miracles that he does. He has these like kind of private accounts that he wants to share.
Hmm.
The transfiguration point's also interesting. Um I think again, I've talked about the signs and how John is depicting them as like pointing to Jesus's true identity. I think the signs kind of substitute in for transfiguration. But if you're looking for a moment in John where Jesus is transfigured, he depicts Jesus, the crucified Jesus, as like the fullness of Jesus's glory. And that moment um, of Jesus's lifting up, I think for John is the moment of exaltation. So if you're going to substitute one to one, I think that would be the transfiguration for
Yeah,
John. Yeah.
right. So that's a rather than having a transfiguration
Hmm.
account, he tells his whole gospel about glory and light.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah,
it's kind of like he takes the transfiguration and interweaves it throughout
yeah.
his entire gospel, and then yeah, it the final glory, the revealing is on the cross.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, he says in John 10, when I am lifted up, then you will see that I am. Or that's John 8, I think. Um, so the I am identity of Jesus is most fully revealed when he's crucified, which is like, yeah, there's a lot to say about that theologically. But again, I think that gets to the point that he's telling us how to interpret the historical data. And I like how you said it, that he's gonna let the truth revealed in the transfiguration be evident throughout the entire life of Jesus. That feels right.
yeah, all right.
Man, John's so good.
I kind of want to end there, and uh, but we never did talk about the authorship of John.
Mm.
Do you think it was John?
Yeah, I'll go with John. The problem is, yeah, in the early church, there's like a couple Johns that are potential candidates. Um, I don't have an issue with saying it's the son of Zebedee, like the disciple. Bauckham, who I tend to agree with in other ways, argues that it's John the Elder, um, who Papias mentions, I think.
Hmm.
Either of those views seem legit to me. Uh, my main beef is just that it's not written by like a community.
Sure.
There aren't that many great texts in history that are just written by a committee. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wait, okay. The epilogue
Hmm.
seems tacked on, chapter 21, and like verse 24, chapter 21. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. We know that his
Hmm.
testimony is true. Um, that I've heard it said like maybe some of John's disciples added that,
Yeah,
like, um,
that seems plausible to me. That seems way more plausible to me than saying like 30 different hands wrote this text and somehow it coheres as a beautiful narrative.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But that might be an actual instance where you point to say uh, John was largely written by one author, and yet its canonization, full compilation, whatever, was done by a community of believers like the church. That
Hmm.
seems reasonable to me.
Yeah. I tend to still think it's John, son of Zebedee.
Yeah,
No
no
reason
problem
to
with
doubt
that.
it.
Yeah,
So, and just like to have who's laying on his chest
right.
at the Last Supper. Um,
Some random influential elder.
just,
Yeah,
I mean, it could be, but it just seems like that's an intimate time with his 12 disciples, and you have three main, Peter, James, and John.
yeah.
It's like, which one of these is it?
Hmm. And
Um,
then they go to Galilee, and the beloved disciples named again there, and they're fishing again. They're like the John, the Peter having breakfast with Jesus scene.
yeah,
And there's like five disciples named there, and then the beloved disciple. So we know it's not one of those five. And John, the son of Zebedee, is not named. So there's a good case to make that it's just him.
yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Just go with the tradition.
Yeah. Usually works.
All right. Any final final things to say?
No, I think I just would highlight again that I think this is a great video. Um, yeah, and I'm really glad that they didn't get mired in some of the academic debates about this. They're doing a good job of helping church people read this text well. Um, so I'm grateful again for their ministry in this good video.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, that brings us to the end of our discussion with or about the Gospel of John. And so tune in next time where we go over Acts.
Woo.